Hello and welcome to the Effective Literacy Podcast. I'm Victoria.
And I'm Anna.
And we're excited to have you with us. If today is your first day with us, we are educators who share a passion for reading and all things literacy. We've come together on this podcast to really better understand the newest research around reading pedagogy. We've noticed a big trend recently towards more phonics instruction, more foundational skills instruction, and less emphasis on content knowledge, language development, meaning making, and even effective expression, which, writing, speaking, all that good stuff. So to make sense of it all, we are interviewing experts from across the nation with extensive knowledge in literacy and multilingual education to have discussions about how to support our students, specifically our multilingual learners, in becoming literate individuals by the time they graduate.
So Victoria and I are together to have a conversation. We've been in education collectively for over 40 years. And as you might have heard in our opening episode, we used to work together. So when we would go to a conference, or especially if we went to the same conference, then we would come back together and talk about the sessions that we went to and what kinds of common themes did we find and how would that impact our work. So we wanted to kind of create the same opportunity in these Making Meaning episodes. So we're going to make an effort to center these episodes around clusters of interviews that have some of those common themes that help us to build our understanding around literacy and is also to stretch our thinking, right? Because we want to continue to be learners. So today we're going to be making meaning of our conversations with the authors of the National Committee for Effective Literacy's white paper toward comprehensive effective literacy policy and instruction for English learner and emergent bilingual students. So that's Dr. Laurie Olsen, Dr. Kathy Escamilla, and Dr. Jody Slavick. So we're going to jump right into it. Victoria, what are you thinking?
They were heavy hitters, but the major thing or thread that I saw going between all three of them, Anna, was this idea of we have to make sure that we're immersing our students in the joy of reading. I mean, I heard Dr. Slavick really talk about that joy of reading is also about that joy of language and playing with language. Dr. Escamilla talked about the joy of reading is also about that joy of writing, which Dr. Olsen also talked about that joy of writing because she says writing is part of the way that we process, part of the way that we think, which, me, I'm always doing a little bit of writing before I ever speak to anyone. I think everyone does that nowadays with,
a little rehearsal is always good.
Rehearsal, yeah. So I mean, that was really one of the biggest things that made me think about and kind of reinforce some of what I talk about all the time, right? That I talk about this whole need to make sure that we're finding that joy, that we're providing lots of different literature for our students to choose from. We're providing different means.
That makes me think about something that I think resonated with me from all three episodes. Also, when we think about, culturally responsive pedagogy and that students really need to connect with the literature that we're using in the classroom. They need to see themselves, see their experiences and their families. And, if we're constantly giving the message, whether it's in early literacy or all the way into middle and high school, that reading's fun. What a way to connect with kids by saying, I loved reading this book so much. And if kids can make a connection to that, they're also making a connection to us as teachers.
Dr. Olsen actually said that whereas school may be primarily an English world, we need that home language. Your children need that home language. And so really, again, kind of making that big connection with parents, right? The parents, we want you to have the joy of reading. And so we're also sending these books home in your home language that you can work with your students on and really kind of build that.
Yeah. And Victoria and I were talking before we were recording, and I was saying, absolutely, as a administrator at an elementary site, that's something that I'm continuing to think about and making sure that I'm deliberately bringing in opportunities to invite families to connect not only with the school site, but literature. So, and books in the home language. So however many families we have and different home languages we have, do we have representation, physical representation of that invitation? Because I can say all day long, you're welcome here, you belong here, come join us. But when I now have books in the home language, now I've made an investment and now I have a physical thing that represents that invitation.
Absolutely. And that invitation piece, Anna, and I think we heard it consistently between the three, that often as schools, we're not the most inviting place. What else are we doing to make sure that we're inviting those families to be part of the learning? And it also made me think a little bit about the metacognition and like the vulnerability of teachers, right? To talk about their own learning.
Right. Because we've taken this concept of like growth mindset with kids and like we learn by making mistakes or we learn by trying new things. And we're really vulnerable. And we taught like, even a third grade teacher, you might just make a mistake on purpose so that you can demonstrate what that looks like for kids. But how do we take this idea of growth mindset and vulnerability and extend it out so that we create this culture of learning that is not just centered in only in the classroom, right? That it's site-wide, that it's district-wide, and that we're looking to build capacity at every level.
So another big theme that I heard that does go along with what we're talking here is about this whole oracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we need to make sure that our students have that strong oral language foundation. As a secondary, I really started to think about when my students speak in class,
Right.
what are they speaking about? And what permission do I give them as far as the topics and like that oral language development?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And at the elementary, we say a lot like kids can't write what they can't say. And they can't just practice it one time. So pushing for those higher academic conversations, or even just extending a social conversation and having multiple ways to enter a conversation, multiple ways to continue a conversation, using different phrases or different structures within your language, it just makes your oral language develop. And then if you are going to take that conversation to writing, or you are going to just kind of lean on that experience to enhance your writing, it gives you more options. So if we can give students an opportunity to have conversations, academic conversations, social conversations, and practice saying it in different ways, they may find out they really like to open a conversation in this one way. And then it gives them confidence, right? And it allows them to then make changes as they develop that oracy.
So this conversation is also making me think about another common kind of theme that we heard was how important teacher knowledge is, and educators continuing to have that professional learning. And we heard, I think all three of them at some point kind of talk about that dual language brain, right? And like the degree of which the dual language brain is like leveraged or ignored really defines whether or not you're having that effective literacy instruction for our English learners and our emergent bilinguals. And it made me think about the professional learning opportunities that our educators have. For me, like I give professional learning right now, right in my current position. And I really started making me think about always starting with the why, right? We know that we start with why are we doing something, but also making connections. We talked about like literacy instruction has to happen all day long. And so like if I'm doing professional learning around math, making sure that I'm also making that connection to language.
So let me keep going on that, Victoria, because as an administrator, I think that, I'm kind of straddling these two places, right? That I know that we're going to need to continue to develop that, because I also think that even the phrase dual language brain, we haven't been talking about. I've been in, English learner development and support provider for much of my career. And that phrase dual language brain is relatively new when it comes to the research and the way that we're thinking about how kids learn. And so if we think about the brain really continuing to develop the home language, and if there's, the instructional language is different, then that's more complex. And it's also, and I think this is where we come to like culturally responsive pedagogy, it's our responsibility as educators to not only value, but continue to develop and see opportunities and make connections. And we talked just a little bit about literacy and having literature in our classroom that shows that value, but what other ways can we continue to do that? However, that's a new move. And so if I'm a monolingual teacher and I teach in English all day, why would I want to do that? Right? Like it's another thing I have to do. And is it really going to be helpful? Because teachers were asking them to do a lot right now, right? As we open schools and think about the complexities that our kids are bringing with us. If this is another layer, we're going to say, yeah, okay, but I want to make sure that it's really going to be worth it for me to do that. So we have to really dig into the why and why it's important for kids to feel valued, but also for families to feel like we are continuing to support the development of the home language. But really, our goal is to continue to develop the brain, right? And to grow the brain in order to become a literate individual, somebody who's a lifelong learner who can move through life and have those skills that they're going to need regardless of the pathway that they're going to take.
So, Anna, I think that there's a lot that I'm still like kind of processing of what you just said. And one of the biggest pieces is about like how sometimes we as educators, we don't know what's going to help our students, what learning that we're undertaking is going to help our students until it does. But I also just think about when I was asked to start teaching the advanced placement course, which for the College Board credit. And I went to a training all about, basically what the College Board expects and the skill sets. And one of the big focuses is on syntactical structure.
Victoria, what does that mean, syntactical structure?
So syntactical structure is, at the simplest form, how sentences are formed. And one of the goals of the advanced placement test, right, is to really make sure that students understand those nuances of language and how those nuances of language really can determine voice, can determine perspective, can hinder or support whatever it is that you're writing about.
So let me bring it to like little guys, right? We give this example all the time. And even Dr. Laurie Olsen gave the example of adjective and noun order, right? Like the paper green or the green paper. So in its like simplest form, that's where we start to see it for our emergent bilinguals at the beginning levels, which is cool because now, and this is kind of what we talked about in our very, very first episode, is this is where Victoria and I start to make connections. What does this look like when I have a 5-year-old who this is their first experience with English and they're saying things in different order, right? So that's syntax. But then let's take it all the way to 12th grade. And we have kiddos who are trying to support in passing the AP exam. And that concept of syntax threads all the way through because it's really about complexity of language and the ability to manipulate language to increase your impact on what you're saying.
Right. So I want to go back and just make sure that we're clear on something though. The syntax though is always taught in conjunction with the literature or with the writing, right? It's never like an extra assignment that has no big connection, that we're always connecting it back. And so we're reading this piece of literature and we're talking about how does the syntax change, right? How does it look? And I'll use one of my favorite books, Jason Reynolds' The Long Way Down, right? And for those of you that haven't read it,
you have to.
But
after you
Mr. Reynolds
to this episode, you need to order
plays with language. He plays with language. He plays with the way the language looks on this page, the way that the line breaks are. He plays with like the order of the language, and it really impacts the meaning.
Right.
And so while I'm teaching that book, I'm going to teach syntax. And I'm going to talk about how does this page, the fact that he created the words in a shape on this page, how does that shape affect what's happening with the character right then? That I'm not just teaching syntax all by itself, that it's interwoven throughout the other pieces of learning. And like I'm bundling those standards together.
And so to take it back to kind of what we were saying a few minutes ago, and one of those big things that we're walking away with after listening to those 3 episodes, Dr. Jody Slavick said kids need to be able to play with language, and they have to be able to play first in order to be able to get to that level. Unless we've given students an opportunity to play in oracy, that's going to feel like a really big stretch. But if I'm comfortable with this idea of syntax in an oral spot, then I'm going to be able to transfer it to that writing or interpreting author's purpose and author's voice in a more kind of succinct way.
Anna, I'm just going to say I love having these conversations with you.
I know. I was like, we're so geeking out on syntax right here, but here it's meaningful and purposeful, right? Like grammar worksheet and like moving a prepositional phrase from one side of a sentence to the other, like, okay, but let's take it to a different level, and let's make it meaningful and fun.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I'm also just going to throw out a little bit more than just syntax, because Dr. Slavick did this too. She said students need to be taught and encouraged to think about different aspects of language. Mm-hmm. She said not just vocabulary, not just grammar, but like dig into the orthography, dig into that morphotic syntactic knowledge, right? And dig into register. Yeah. We, again, and this goes back to that teacher learning aspect. Like if we don't know this, let's like learn a little bit about it. Yeah. And let's play with our students, right? Let's encourage with our students. If we change the sound of this morpheme, like how does it change everything about what we're learning, right? How can we play with the language? How do other authors play with the language? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, Anna, big question.
We could talk about this forever. Sorry.
I know. What are you still thinking about? Like what's still kind of just rolling around that you're like, I gotta keep my own learning on this subject?
It's a lot. Going back and listening to the episodes multiple times, you pick up something that, in the moment when we were doing the interviews, maybe I didn't think about as deeply. I think for me in the forefront of my mind, and I kind of already talked about it, but for me right now, when we're recording this, we're getting ready to, open schools up again. And as a administrator to a new site this year, I am really thinking about assets-based approach for our English learners, and how do we really come to a common understanding around the students that enter our school, whether it's in kindergarten or in 5th grade. What assets do they bring to us in their home language? How do we connect and build to that? And then beyond that, how do we extend that to families? If we have a 5th grade student who's, we are a monolingual school or monolingual instruction. So if we have an English learner who's in 5th grade, I still want to know, what are the assets that this student has in the home language, and how do we build on that so we can make sure that we are providing the supports that student needs. And family. Right? Like I said, like really extending it out to the family, and how do we make sure that family feels like, yes, your student's instruction has been in English for the last 5 years. However, that doesn't mean that home language doesn't play a role, and that it's not valued and welcomed here. So how do we make sure that invitation, that word that Laurie Olsen used, just really stuck with me, is how do we make sure that invitation is very, very clear?
And I mean, I think that like the word invitation is actually a good place for us to end today on, because it's a good thing to think about, right? What invitations am I presenting to my students? What invitations am I presenting to my families? What invitations am I presenting to my colleagues? Mm-hmm. Right? And also, how am I receiving those invitations? And so I think that that's a great place to end today. I want to thank you for joining us and for listening. We are the Effective Literacy Podcast. For more information, to get access to resources mentioned today, please visit our show notes at multilingualliteracy.org and really subscribe to our podcast. We're available everywhere that a podcast is. So find us, subscribe, tell your friends, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.